Chapter 39 ends with Joseph in an Egyptian prison. Falsely accused of rape, he began his sentence like any other prisoner. But as it was when he arrived as a slave in Potiphar's house, God blessed all that Joseph did. It didn't take long for the keeper of the prison to recognize it. Joseph became, for all intents and purposes, the chief steward running the prison, though he was himself one of its inmates. Then a fateful meeting occurred. Before we get to that, we might wonder how long Joseph's been in Egypt. How long was he first a slave in Potiphar's house and then a manager of the prison? Well, the story goes back to when he was in Canaan and he was 17, we're told. It had to have been at least a couple of years for him to rise to be chief steward of Potiphar's estate. So let's say 3 years there, making him about 20 when Mrs. Potiphar decided to make her play and then accused him of attempted rape. It's safe to say that Joseph was in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, a bit later when his brothers finally appear before him in Egypt. It's unlikely that the Egyptians would allow anyone younger than that to be the Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister, as Joseph's station was by that time. That means that Joseph may have been in prison for several years before his fateful meeting that we are about to read of. You know, we love the story of Joseph's faithfulness in the midst of deep disappointment and dark discouragement. I think it's really all the more remarkable when we realize how long his trial went on. It's one thing to trust God for an hour. It's another to trust him for a decade or more. Well, we read in verse 1 of chapter 40, "It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. And so he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. And so they were in custody for a while." Potiphar, Joseph's previous master, was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. So think, well, the head of the Egyptian secret service. It was his job to sniff out plots against the throne, and apparently Potiphar found one, but wasn't sure who was behind it, the baker or the butler. Now, by butler, think the guy who's responsible for all those who served Pharaoh and his family. They provided all of the attendants who served the royal table. The baker, of course, oversaw the menu. All the meals served the royal family and state affairs. His field of purview was everything from the field and the vineyard to the dishes that were served Pharaoh and his guests. Potiphar, I guess, discovered a plot to poison Pharaoh through his food or drink. So both the butler and the baker were thrown in the pokey while the investigation was made to determine when the poison was introduced. Was it during the meal preparation or was it afterwards while it was being carried by the butler's team? Joseph, who's been given charge over his fellow prisoners, was tasked with taking care of these guys. We read in verse 5, "Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came in to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. And so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of the Lord's house." Now, let's just pause right there before we complete the verse, because there's some things that we need to take a look at here. It seems that these 2 prisoners, the butler and the baker, they weren't in the gen pop of the prison. Don't ask me how I know that's the term that you use for the general population of a jail or a prison. It's just the average run-of-the-mill jailbirds. No, apparently these 2 were sequestered in a special part of the prison and were being tended by elite guards. As the manager of the prison, they fell under Joseph's oversight. One morning, as he goes into their cells, probably bringing them that day's meal, he notices that they're bummed out about something, and so he asks them. He says, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." Now note the assumption on their part that their dream meant something. It wasn't just that it was unsettling. They assumed that dreams were more than just mind degassing, de-stressing, if you will. The ancients believed that dreams were a way that the unseen realm communicated with the waking world. And so the butler and the baker were unsettled since they assumed their dreams meant something important, but they had no clue what that was. If the spirit realm was communicating with them and they couldn't understand the communication, well, they would be deeply troubled. That distress played out in their countenance, and Joseph saw it. And so he asked, "Hey guys, why are you upset?" Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." Joseph didn't know what the dreams meant, but he knew who did, God. And since he knew God, he asked them to tell their dreams. Maybe God would tell him, Joseph, their meaning. Verse 9. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler." So Joseph interpreted the butler's dream as meaning that he would be exonerated of all charges and restored to his post. And then Joseph adds this in verse 14. "But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon." Joseph was content in his circumstances, but he was not content with them. Freedom is always to be preferred to imprisonment. If it's possible to become free, one ought to seek it. Joseph's imprisonment was due to an injustice carried out against him by a vengeful woman. He ought not have been in prison, but he waited on God for the timing to get out. He recognized that this was a potential door through which he could gain his freedom. It's interesting that the Apostle Paul gives much the same counsel to slaves in 1 Corinthians 7 when he tells them to serve the Lord as slaves, but if they have the opportunity to secure their freedom, to do so. He speaks of that in verses 20 through 24. Now we read on, verse 16. "When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." So it seems that Potiphar's investigation discovered that the baker was behind the conspiracy to assassinate Pharaoh, and so he was executed. Verse 20. "Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all of his servants. He lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them." Then this sad comment is added as a postscript in verse 23. "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." Joseph's forgotten. Well, forgotten on earth by man, but never forgotten in heaven by God. God's eye was on Joseph the whole time. The thing is, there are some pieces that need to be moved into place before Joseph can emerge from prison. And God didn't hold counsel with him. He didn't send Joseph an email telling him to hang on. He didn't update him every week on the progress of God's plans. And wouldn't we love it if God would make us privy to his counsel? If he would send us progress reports and monthly charts showing us milestones and a checklist of completed tasks. Yeah, we'd love that. But God doesn't. No, he gives us his word, his promise. And really, once. You see, God really is working all things together for good. He really is. He will never leave us and never forsake us. That's his promise. What he began, he will finish. And with God, once is enough. Because he is not a man that he could lie, nor the son of man that he could change his mind. I want to repeat something that we considered in the last episode, our last study. While from Joseph's perspective, his commitment to the Lord only seemed to serve to, push him into ever more dark and desperate circumstances, from our advantage of hindsight, as we read the story, we see that God was positioning him exactly where he needed to be in order to rise to a place of exaltation and where he could be an instrument in saving hundreds of thousands of lives, many millions of future generations. Having faith in God means that no matter what our present circumstances, we cling to the truth that God is in control and he will work all things together for good. God isn't just interested in getting us to the goal or the end. He knows that it's the journey which shapes us into the people we need to be when we get to that end. Years ago, I went on a backpacking trip that had several miles of cross-country hiking on it. There was no trail. Now, on the map, it looked like we could do it, but in reality, it was this shy of impassable. On the hike in, when we were on the trail, we went down a place called Doozy Basin. It took us all day, and when we were finished, we were exhausted. Then, during the cross-country part of the trip, we hiked and climbed through brush and terrain that was so difficult. We only made 3 miles one entire day of 8 hours of hiking. There were times that day that the 3 of us despaired of making it out, but there was nothing else to do but to keep going. Yeah, and eventually we did. We made it back to a trail. That 3 miles of this short of impassable terrain had so toughened us and so changed our perspective on hiking that when we went up Doozy Basin, we made the entire trail in 3.5 hours. It had taken us 6 hours to hike down, but only 3.5 to go up. We felt like we were flying. I remember all 3 of us chuckling as we passed people on the trail who were huffing and puffing. Learning to water ski can be a challenge, and that's getting up on 2 skis. But then you go to 1, you slalom. And once you've slalomed, skiing on 2 skis, it's a piece of cake. When learning to snow ski, you start on 140s. As you get better, you progress to 180s and 190s, maybe even 200s. But then you put on a pair of 140s and you feel like you could do all kinds of freestyle tricks. It's so easy. In Jeremiah 12:5, God asks the prophet, "If you have run with footmen and they have wearied you, then how can you contend with horses?" God had big plans for Jeremiah. He would stand before kings and speak a hard word of warning and judgment, but Jeremiah only was complaining to God about some petty officials that were opposing him. So God challenged Jeremiah. You're upset because nobodies won't listen? And you want to quit because little guys reject you? Jeremiah, if that's your reaction when confronted with such simple opposition, what are you going to do when the highest ruler in the land threatens you? And yet you say you want to be my messenger? Joseph had begun learning his skills as an administrator and an overseer the moment his father gave him that special tunic with those long sleeves and ankle-length hem. But when he'd learned all that he could from overseeing Jacob's household, God had to take him from elementary school to high school and placed him in Potiphar's house. When he'd learned all that he could about administration at that level, God moved him to the college of the king's prison. His graduation was about to come, but Joseph's years in the school of hard knocks was all for a good and divine purpose. Friends, listen, Joseph's story is ours. Just as he was destined for the throne of Egypt, so you and I are destined in Christ for an even greater throne, to rule and to reign with him for 1,000 years. This life right now is our school. And like Joseph, we ought to be concerned with only one thing, not the circumstances, but the lessons, and being faithful with them.